Hi, everyone, and welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Lynn Hazim. I've been at Google for a bit over 7 years now, and I'm super excited to be moderating this chat with the one and only Anissa Helou. So I'll spend the first half of the talk chatting with Anissa and asking her a few questions, but we'll leave the second half for you guys to ask her any questions that you have. So feel free to use the YouTube live chat feature that we have. So with that, I'd love to introduce Anissa Helou by reading her bio. So Anissa Helou is a chef, food writer, journalist, broadcaster, consultant, and blogger, focusing on the cuisine and culinary heritage of the Middle East, Mediterranean, North Africa, and most recently, the Islamic world. Born and raised between Beirut, Lebanon, and Mashta al-Helou, Syria, she knows the Mediterranean as only a well-traveled native can. Anissa is the author of numerous award-winning cookbooks, including Feast, Food of the Islamic World, Sweet Middle East, Levant, Lebanese cuisine, and many more. She was listed in 2013 in the Arabian Business Magazine as one of the 100 most influential Arab women, as well as on the 500 most influential Arabs. Anissa's first book, Lebanese Cuisine, was published just over 25 years ago, and her purpose for writing it, despite her being an art consultant, was to record her mother's recipes, not only for herself, but for the younger generation of Lebanese who had been displaced by the war and at risk of losing their culinary heritage. Since then, she has concentrated her work on preserving Middle Eastern culinary lore, expanding her horizon in her 9th cookbook, which is now the recipient of a James Beard Award, to include the whole Islamic world. So with that, we'll go ahead and welcome Anissa.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Anissa.
Nice introduction. I'm fine, thank you.
Of course, I'm so happy to have you here. It's really a pleasure and a privilege for me. I mean, I'm sure you know how much of a fan of you and your work I am. So I'm really excited to talk about food and preserving culinary heritage. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask you a bit more of a holistic question, just how you're doing in general. It's been a very difficult few months, and especially recently with what happened in Beirut. So I just wanted to know how you're coping with things, how you're doing.
Well, I mean, I was as shocked as everybody else was with what happened in Beirut, and as sort of unbelieving, as it were. It's kind of unimaginable that something like this should be allowed to happen in the middle of the city. And as far as COVID is concerned, I have to say that I can't say that I enjoyed it, but I found it quite painless, mainly because I was making ice cream every day and enjoying sort of fairly good food. And my flat has terraces, so I didn't feel like But in Italy, we were not allowed to go further than 200 meters. I did break that rule fairly regularly, but just for walking, not for anything else, or shopping, but shopping a bit further than my house. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't that different from the way I live. I spent a lot of time at home writing, testing recipes. So, I mean, I didn't go out to restaurants. That was the only really annoying thing, but otherwise it was fine.
I mean, for those who don't know, Anissa lives in Sicily, and she has a beautiful apartment that overlooks the Mediterranean Sea. So you really, I mean, if I were you, you don't need to go anywhere else. So I have a lot of questions for you on food and preserving cultural heritage and so on. But before I start, I have another few questions that I didn't run by you before. It's a bit of a surprise. And I want you to answer them just as fast as you can, just intuitively, whatever comes to your mind. So if you had to pick between tabbouleh or fattoush?
Tabbouleh.
Hummus or labneh?
Labneh.
Shish barak or kebab laban?
Shish barak.
Manouche za'atar or cheese manouche?
Za'atar.
Beef shawarma or chicken shawarma?
Lamb shawarma.
Okay. It's exactly what I would have answered myself. So I'm I'm glad we're on the same page. But before we deep dive into the world of food, I'd love to go back to the beginning, if you don't mind. So you started your career in art. You spent almost 20 years working in art, whether it's at Sotheby's in London or having your own antique shop in Paris, or even being an art advisor in Kuwait. So how did that evolve into you writing your first cookbook? What happened? What changed? What was the switch that ticked?
It actually happened by accident. There was the Gulf War was the Gulf War was the kind of impetus for a change, not necessarily in career, but a change in general. So my art consulting in Kuwait had come to a standstill, but at the same time I was getting a bit bored, and I've always wanted to write, and I thought maybe that's a good time to kind of switch to writing. But I wanted to write about collecting because I had collected things with my limited means, and I wanted to write about the same people who had collected very interesting stuff without spending too much money. And I got myself a literary agent who introduced me to a Lebanese friend. And we went to dinner there, and they started talking about cookbooks. And as I was listening to them, I was thinking there isn't a Lebanese cookbook that is user-friendly for those who don't know the cuisine. Then the Lebanese friend immediately said, oh, there is the Bible by Reyes. Okay. To be honest, I didn't even know Reyes then. But I checked it, and a recipe for chicken would start by, catch your chicken, kill it, pluck it, wash it. And then I thought, in 1992,
when was it written, this book?
It was first published in 1958. Her uncle was Albert Hourani, the historian, and he was very encouraging. But I thought, I knew nothing about writing cookbooks. And I thought I could write it in 3 months, get my mother's recipes, and then write them. But my agent made me sweat. I spent 6 months writing the proposal. I spent hours in the British Library. I got myself mentors. I started buying cookbooks. I had a boyfriend who had a huge collection of cookbooks.
Did you cook at that point?
I cooked, but I still cook like this, not on a daily basis. And in those days, I cooked only for dinner parties. So when I invited friends, I cooked. And I didn't cook as much Lebanese food as I cooked European food or whatever that took my fancy. But I was a good cook. I was passionate about food, of course. And I loved markets. And my mother is an amazing cook. My grandmother is even better. And my aunt did everything at home, my Syrian aunt. So I knew a lot about food, and I was very interested in food. And in fact, when I cooked for dinner parties and spent the day in the kitchen, I would think, why am I doing this, wasting my time? It should be a profession. It became my profession. But without me making a conscious, it was just like a whim. Me saying, oh, I could write this cookbook. It happened that a publisher wanted somebody to write a Lebanese cookbook. And then my agent was a very good editor who helped me a lot, introduced me to people in the field. Her father was one of the great food people in London, Alan Davidson, kind of legend. And so kind of by sheer concours de circonstance, I entered into this world and basically succeeded in it.
So your first cookbook was the Lebanese cookbook, right?
Yeah.
Which is basically your mom's recipes.
It's basically my mom's book because all the information from her, all the recipes are hers. I mean, I just kind of adjusted the recipes from kamshe, a handful of this and a coffee cup of that, and cook until it's done without saying half an hour or an hour or 2 hours. So I kind of adjusted the recipes to an audience, to a readership who didn't know about that food. And but I thank her, I thank her a lot in the introduction.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. Because that's what I wanted to ask you about, because Arab moms, Lebanese moms, they can't really give you a recipe. It's very, they cook with their senses. It's just the way they learned it from their moms. And then, so how was the experience of just trying to document what your mom is doing when for her she's just living her life? It's just natural for her. It's like she doesn't understand why you're asking her how much salt you put.
Well, my mother, thankfully, is an angel and a very patient lady and a wonderful lady, unlike me. And we spent months together cooking these recipes and fighting, because my mother would say, but honestly, why are you asking me these questions? And I say, but Mom, you know how to cook these things. I know because I've watched you, but there are people who don't know. And I'm writing this book not only for people who know the food, but people who don't know the food and want to cook it. And the reason why this book was successful was because a lot of people could cook from it, reproduce the recipes without having been to Lebanon, without knowing Lebanese food, to a standard that was totally authentic.
It doesn't tell them just get the meat out of the freezer. It explains a bit more what to ask the butcher for.
Exactly.
So that was the first one, and then what followed is just an evolution.
Then when I finished, it was published. It was very well reviewed, and I entered into this world, as somebody who was quite respected. I then decided not to stay into the Lebanese niche, because first of all, it's a very small country. And even though there are regional variations, it is not a field that you can stay in for years and years and years. So my next book was actually not even my idea. It was a publisher's idea on Moroccan street food. But I liked writing about street food. And then I suggested a book on Mediterranean street food. Yeah. And that's where I began traveling for food.
So that's what I want to ask you. So you started with a Lebanese cookbook, and then Mediterranean, and then you had a book on food from the Levant, and then Middle Eastern, and then finally food from the Islamic world. So what I wanted to tell you is, can you talk to us a bit about the diversity of food that we have in the region, especially for non-Arabs, people not from the Middle East, who kind of group this cuisine together? So what actually groups these cuisines together, but what actually sets them apart? And I wanted to also get your views on why did you choose food from the Islamic world versus food from the Arab world or food from the Middle East, as we know?
Well, first, grouping the food, you have distinct regions with influences. The Levant is basically influenced by Ottoman. Let's say Iranian cuisine or Persian cuisine is the mother cuisine. But after
the cuisine of Middle East
and the Islamic empires, let's say. But then the Ottomans came in the 15th century, I think. I have a terrible memory, but anyway. And then they developed a very elaborate cuisine that is basically the cuisine of the Levant. The Levant being where the sun rises, and it's Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Turkey, even bits of Greece, but the Balkans mostly.
Yeah.
And so even though each country has a different cuisine, you have the same dishes, but cooked differently, like stuffed vine leaves, kibbeh, that's called kofta in Turkey and all this. But you notice if you go and eat in Syria or if you go and eat in Turkey, you have the same dishes, but they're treated differently, and they're quite distinct from the Lebanese version. Then you have North Africa, and North Africa changes from where the Ottomans were and where they were not. So Morocco is where the Ottomans were not, and Moroccan cuisine is quite distinct from Algerian or Tunisian. And that Moroccan cuisine is closer to Iranian. And you have the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan even. They're quite close. And then, so you have like Middle East, and then you have the Gulf that goes into the Middle East. That is for the sort of grouping of the different cuisines of, let's say, the Middle East. And there's this habit in the West talking about Middle Eastern cuisine or Middle Eastern food, which is actually inaccurate, because you can't group them all together. And I kind of thought about it and decided not to, because people, I mean, Claudia Roden, who's the guru of Middle Eastern food, had written about it. Paula Wolford had written about it. And even though I could bring in a lot of original material, I thought I didn't really want to do something that wasn't entirely original. And with the Arab uprising, the Arab Spring, and actually the vilification of Muslims and Islam, it occurred to me that a positive way to represent the religion and the people was through the food.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe the foods of Islam would be a very good subject. So I offered that as an idea to my agent, and they liked it.
So outside of the Middle East, which countries does it involve as well?
The food of the Islamic world.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's huge, because you go, like, you have Africa, bits of Africa, North Africa, the Levant, the Middle East. It goes all the way to northwest China, in Uyghur country, Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world, and India, Pakistan. I mean, I went a bit everywhere.
But how did you, I mean, what I think is really nice is that people associate Islam with the Middle East, when in fact it's a lot broader than this. And as you said, Indonesia has the biggest population of Muslim people in the world. But I think also, how did you understand these recipes? I mean, it's a bit easier probably for you to understand recipes from the Arab world, it's closer and so on and so on. But what did you do? You traveled there and then you met local people that introduced you to their recipes, or?
Yeah, I traveled not to all the countries. I mean, there are some countries that I missed. Malaysia I missed because of time. But I went, and some African countries I didn't go to because I didn't feel they were safe for me on my own. The same with Algeria, which I wanted to go to, but I didn't. But I went to Uyghur country, I went to Zanzibar, I went to India. I had been to India before, but I went back to India, but to the sort of Mughal cities like Hyderabad, Lucknow. I went to Kashmir. I went to Senegal. I went to lots of different places.
More of an excuse for you to travel the world than writing off the cookbook.
It was
like, how can I make it broader than the Middle East so that I can travel even further away?
It was totally, I have to say, it was totally fascinating. And I had help from lots of people. I mean, I have quite a huge network of friends and acquaintances in the food world. So I asked for help where I couldn't, manage to meet people on my own. And I cooked with some home cooks. I ate a lot everywhere, on the street, in restaurants. I tried to eat as much in homes as I could. I visited the markets. And so it was totally eye-opening. Then when I went back home to kind of write the recipes and test them, I cross-referenced with my library. As you can see behind me, I have lots of cookbooks. And I did, with this online thing, I did a lot of research also on YouTube, because you have a lot of kind of home cooks. You have a lot of videos of cooking videos that are free to access. Some are good, some are not. And I mean, obviously, I've been writing about food for 25 years, so I can make a sort of judgment on what is good and what is not, what is authentic, who is messing with recipes and who's not. So, I did my research, in situ, as it were, by traveling, in libraries or in my own books, using my own books, talking to people as well, writing to friends or to people I knew who were experts to kind of also cross-reference. And then watching these videos, which were quite fascinating, to be honest.
So what would you say is your favorite cuisine from one of these countries? After Lebanon and Syria.
No, my favorite cuisine is Japanese. It has nothing to do.
I bet you don't get any of that in Sicily.
No, unfortunately not.
You mentioned a point on eating at home and home cooks, and that's one thing I wanted to discuss with you. I mean, one thing that sets the Middle East apart from the Western world is that the stars of cooking are usually home cooks and not restaurant chefs, not restaurant owners. I mean, coming from, I don't know, my mom, my grandma, my aunts, these are the people that I look up to. I don't even know the chefs behind some of the biggest restaurants in Lebanon. Why do you think that is? And is that a good or a bad thing, in your opinion?
I don't know if it's good or bad. I think there is something about our cuisine, let's say, I'll concentrate on the Levant because that's where we come from. Where the home cooked meals are the great meals. But there is one thing, though, that if you want to eat meze, you're not going to go to your mom or to your grandmother or your aunt or whoever. You're going to go to a restaurant. The reason why home cooks are more sort of revered or respected or whatever is that the profession in the Middle East or in the Levant of a chef is like a job. It's not a creative. They're not seen as creative. And most restaurant owners,
like they are,
hire cooks. They don't cook themselves. I mean, now you have the younger generation and they do interesting things. But it hasn't yet developed into a sort of, let's say, proper movement.
Yeah, that's very true. I wanted to talk about food as a tool to preserve cultural heritage, especially in our part of the world, especially in what we're seeing happening recently between Iraq, Syria, and most recently Lebanon. How do you think we can use food as a tool to tell our story?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's what I did with feast food of the Islamic world, is to, you have a very rich culture, civilization that people have forgotten about. And food is culture. So wherever you go, people want to talk about food. In the Middle East in particular, or in the Arab world, food is part of the fabric of life. It's part of hospitality. It's part of family life. I mean, nothing happens without food, the celebrations, the feast. When you visit somebody at home, like I feel totally non-Lebanese when I receive people in my house and give them a glass of water or a cup of coffee and nothing else. I mean, in London, it's worse than in Sicily because in Sicily, they're more hospitable. But sometimes I can have people come and I don't give them anything. And I'm thinking, if my mother sees
Exactly. There's always your mom in the back of your head. What would she think of you if she saw like what you were offering to people, or if you ordered delivery and didn't cook something yourself? Or
It's true. So so food is so much part of our lives that it's part of our history, it's part of our culture, and that's where preservation is very important. Is you're telling stories, you're writing about history, you're writing about culture, about traditions, and this, if it's lost, it's really sad because it's a very important part of life that is not, documented. And when I started writing about food, I remember like writing travelogues, reading travelogues, looking at sources. And in those days, there was very little about food. There were no food studies yet.
I mean, that's why you wrote your first cookbook, right?
Exactly. I mean, because I wanted to, my mother being such a wonderful cook, I wanted to be able to cook her food once she was gone. I mean, thankfully, she's still with us. But I kind of pride myself with my sister and my brother as like the cook of the family who will take over once my mother is gone, because I know how to cook her food. And also for all those young people, I mean, like you, but you were too young during the Civil War. But let's say now with the explosion and everything, you're not going to go back home that much more often. And so, I mean, for people to be able to reproduce their own food, young Lebanese people, to reproduce their own food the way their mother cooked it, the way their grandmother cooked it. I mean, of course, my mother and my grandmother are from the mountains of Lebanon, and they're Maronites, so it's one way of cooking. It's not the Muslims' way of cooking, or even the Greek Orthodox. I mean, there's a lot of variation in Lebanon, in this tiny country. And that's why I wrote it, and that's how I continue to work. I mean, to do my work.
We talked a bit about this previously, and how the refugee crisis in Syria actually affected how people perceive Syrian food, and that they became more aware of the food from Syria. So if you can talk a bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the few positives that came out. In fact, if not the only positive that came out of the situation in Syria, is that with the huge number of refugees going all over the world, I gave a talk in Canada about how they could earn a living having the women, because most of them didn't work at home, is they're all very good cooks. I mean, some are better than others, but they have natural talents, sewing, cooking, preparing vegetables. They have natural talents that they could, to use a modern expression, monetize. And that's what happened, a lot of catering, and there were initiatives, like in Canada, they set up this newcomer kitchen where they asked these ladies to cater. So they cooked like they cooked at home, and they sold their food. And more and more people started finding out about Syrian food, tasting it, knowing about it. More books were published. When I wanted to publish a book on Syrian food like 20 years ago or more, nobody was interested in it.
Then there were too many cookbooks about Syria. Once you don't have a space there anymore. But what do you think as expats? I mean, for me personally, as a Lebanese expat, what can I do to preserve that heritage? What can I do to make sure that we keep this?
Well, first of all, you can ask your mother, your grandmother, if she's still alive, your aunts. You can record their recipes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that, like, I saw some things you posted on Instagram from your mother cooking, which were very different from my mother's. So, you can record all this, write down the recipes, or even do oral history with your mother, kind of record her, or do Instagram lives or whatever, and keep this tradition for later. I mean, now you can go back and eat your mother's food, but one day you won't be able to, and you will crave that taste of childhood, or just that taste of family.
Well, that's very true. And I wanted to ask you this. I mean, I cook probably 5% of what my mom cooks. And I just think I think my mom cooks probably 50% of what my grandma cooks, because some of the things that used to take my grandma hours, she's not going to do them anymore. And I just think about the evolution of a specific cuisine with time, as people cook a lot less and have less time for cooking. I mean, have you seen this, that what people used to cook 100 years ago is very different from what a cuisine of a specific country looks today?
I think in food cultures, people are so attached to their food that they keep the tradition alive. When it gets lost by young people not wanting to cook and not learning, and then finding out a bit too late that they've missed the chance of learning these recipes. But there are enough people still cooking in our culture not to lose too much. But the danger is when you have a disruption. The disruption in our case, let's say with this enormous explosion in Beirut, is for a lot of people are leaving. As soon as people leave their country and don't go back often, they start changing their food. If I went to Mississippi once to do a demonstration of Lebanese food, and then they took me to a Lebanese restaurant, and everything was like so unlike what I knew. The tabbouleh was completely different from a regular tabbouleh. Not only because it had more burghul, but maybe it had cucumbers. I can't remember, but it was like absolutely not the tabbouleh that I know. Kibbeh was completely different, everything. But there are countries, for instance, like in Brazil, which has a huge community of Lebanese, where I went to a restaurant in Sao Paulo and she had shish barak on the menu. No Lebanese restaurant has shish barak on the menu.
Very true, yeah.
And they in this case they kept their tradition. They even spoke with the same accent that where the village from the village where they came from. So it depends on the country, but in some countries, in the case of Syrian refugees, because they're so poor, they cannot cook the way they cooked at home. They don't have access to meat as much as before, so they make kibbeh with potatoes, or they don't make it, or I don't know, they gave me mahalabi in one of the refugee families that I went to, and that was quite different. And then she explained to me that after the first few days of the month, the money they get from the World Food Program, they can't buy certain things, so they change their cooking, or they don't cook as much as before. And slowly the knowledge disappears.
But following up on that, we see reluctance to modernize our food as well. I mean, a few restaurants have tried to create Lebanese fine dining or Middle Eastern fine dining, and none of them have been really successful. I'm not sure if it's because, as an audience, we don't accept a modern version of our food, or if the concepts as they are weren't that great. But where do you see the evolution of Middle Eastern cuisine? And I'm not, like, by Middle Eastern, it's every country by itself. And do you think we need to modernize it now?
I'm for both takes. I'm for kind of I personally am very traditional in my approach and very purist. So my cooking, I tried modernizing a little bit in one of my books, Modern Meze, but I didn't modernize that much. And I'm not that keen on modernizing myself, because I think the food is so good that, if I make these dishes perfectly the way my mother or other cooks make them, I'm very happy. But there is space for talent. But unfortunately, I don't think we have yet enough talent, because it started... The first, I think, who started modernizing Middle Eastern food is Greg Manouf in Australia, and he did it very well. Now you have other chefs who are doing it, Philippe Massoud to a certain point, in New York, other people, young people in Lebanon.
Although most of them outside of the region. So do you think it's more accepted by the West than by Middle Eastern people themselves to have a modern version of their food?
Well, if we take the example of Lebanon, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you know this, but whenever I invite Lebanese people to lunch or dinner for a Lebanese meal in my house, and I'm a good cook, I make like perfect kibbeh, etc. But the first comment would be,
it's not like
but my mother or my grandmother or whatever. So there is this attachment to the way they know their food. Whether it's their family, their region, or whatever. And because the food culture is so strong, there is this very strong attachment to how the food should be. And almost everybody is a gourmet in Lebanon. I'm taking Lebanon as an example, but Italy could be another example, China, whatever. Wherever food culture is very strong. But then you have this young generation who actually see the job of a chef as a creative job, as against a jobbing job, as it were, who are interested in playing with the ingredients. Like there's this young chef, Tarek Alameddin, who worked at Noma and who's trying to do interesting things. Or even, Youssef Hakiki, who was at Burgundy, who one meal I had there, he had asafir, but in a completely different way. So there are young chefs who are trying to do interesting things. But I think the whole movement is in its infancy still.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Anissa. We'll go ahead and switch over to some audience questions. So let's see what we have from the audience. If you haven't submitted your question yet, you can do so in the chat window. So the first question is from Jahim. So hi, Anissa, great to have you with us. Of all the Middle Eastern cuisines, which would you say has the best chance of scaling the heights of the fine dining world, and why?
Several, I would say. You have Iranian, which is already sort of fine dining when it's done like in a very sophisticated manner, but can be sort of elevated. Moroccan is another great cuisine that can be elevated, Turkish and Lebanese, but Syrian as well. I would say that they're already great cuisines, and in the hands of a talented young or even not so young chef who understands the basics but also understands Western techniques, and they combine both, it would be very interesting.
I agree. Let's see what else we have. So from Maya. Hi, Anissa. Thank you so much for being here. You mentioned you went on a discovery of street food across the Mediterranean. What were your favorite street food meals?
Well, one that I adore is the stuffed mussels in Turkey, in Istanbul or in Izmir. And when I discovered them, I had about more than a dozen, one after the other. I mean,
although the idea is not appetizing at all. When someone tells you mussels with rice, it doesn't.
Exactly. But it's such an amazing thing. And it's also so ridiculously cheap when you think of the labor. But I love the meshwi in Morocco. I also like fatir in Egypt, but they have, or the stuffed pigeons that I had on the street as well, even though it's not particularly street food. And in Lebanon, of course, shawarma.
Yeah.
And sahla.
Street food in Sicily.
In Sicily, we have there is a lot of street food during festivals more than every day. But they have one particular specialty, which is milk-fed intestines wrapped around the spring onion and grilled. It sounds terrible, but it's absolutely delicious.
We'll move on to the next question. Let's see what else we have from the audience. So from Shifali, if an amateur home cook wanted to write a cookbook to preserve their culture, what's your advice for how they should approach this?
Well, a lot of research, a lot of eating with very good traditional cooks, whether it's the family or others, and writing down the recipes in a very accurate manner. And then doing a lot of research on the information around the recipes, social context, history, anecdotes, without being syrupy or sentimental.
How do you test recipes actually? Like you get the recipe from your mom and then you do it yourself and then...
Yeah, I write the recipe down and then I go into the kitchen and I weigh everything. I do the mise en place. And then as I'm cooking, I realize that, for instance, if I'm doing a bread, there isn't enough hydration, not enough water, so I adjust that. Or, if I'm doing a stew, there isn't enough tomatoes, for instance, for yakhni. So, I mean, usually my mother's recipes, for my mother, her recipes were very accurate, except that I didn't have precise, instructions. So I needed instructions. So you can be given a recipe and half of the instructions are not there. They will say, okay, do this, cook the onions. It doesn't tell you whether they should be golden or golden brown or crispy or whatever. So as you test, you get the right, and then whatever it needs to be. And then you write the instructions and then the measurements as well.
And then do you go through a recipe tester or you're the recipe tester?
In my case, for the feast, I had a friend in California who's the head chef at Chez Panisse, and she tested almost all the recipes in her American kitchen.
That's nice.
I had tested most of them and she tested them again.
Let's see what else we have from the audience. So Songul is asking you, hi Anissa, fabulous talk, thank you. I'm hungry now. What is, in your opinion, the emblematic dish representing Lebanese cuisine?
So difficult. I'm going to get lynched now, but for me it would be I would say a typical Lebanese meal would be tabouleh, kibbeh bisaniye, laban khiyar. And
for those who don't, because I think even those who speak Arabic might not know what kibbeh bisaniye is.
It's a kind of meat pie made with minced lamb and burgle, which is cracked wheat, with onion, minced lamb, and pine nut stuffing inside that is kind of highly seasoned with spices, not chili, not hot spices, but just regular spices.
So not hummus.
I think everybody, what?
You don't think hummus is?
No, hummus, yes, but no. I mean, hummus is like has become global, so it's no longer a sort of national dish.
It's become a spread. Anything that's spreadable is a hummus.
Exactly. Right? And it's become a generic term, which I'm actually quite against.
Yeah.
But kibbeh bisaniye is one of the national dishes of Lebanon.
Next time we have you over, we'll do a demo of kibbeh bisaniye. Let's see what else we have from the audience. So Alexandra, hi Anissa, thank you for being with us today. If you had to choose a single recipe for a really special occasion, what would it be?
I would do Iranian jeweled rice. It's one of my favorite rices. It's a rice that is slightly sweet and savory, and it has pistachios, carrots, almonds, I think, barberries, which are kind of sour. It's a berry that is slightly sour. And orange zest.
Yeah.
And it's an amazingly refined, sophisticated dish that I actually do sometimes when I invite people with a whole baby lamb. And it takes me like half a day to make it.
For something that is sometimes a side dish for other people. But speaking of Iranian rice, how many rice variations do they have?
Endless. They have there are 3 different ways of cooking rice in Iran. One, which is where you parboil the rice and then you steam it. The other is you boil it with enough water so that it absorbs the water completely. It's called kateh. The other is called pilau. And then one which is baked, and it's called tahshin. And within these, you have endless. Kateh, not so much, but like the pilaus, you have layered. It can be layered with broad beans and dill, or with lentils, or with all that jeweled rice that is amazing. I mean, there are endless variations.
Let's see what else we have from the crowd. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. I think it's Abe or Abe. Thanks so much for the suggestion of writing. The Instagram generation won't have anything to pass down to their children except pictures of dishes. What's your favorite Lebanese dish?
Well, kibbeh bisaniye is one of my favorite, but mehshi is like the stuffed vegetables, especially the vegetarian ones, or the cabbage, and that kind of courgette called ara. This is one of my favorite dishes.
You told me your mom does a really good mehshi, right?
Yeah.
That's a good book in the Lebanese cookbook.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if there's any more questions from the crowd. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So from Aisha, hey Anissa, thanks so much for today. I had to have ice cream while watching the talk. What is the most odd dish you had in the Arab world you did not expect?
Well, I don't know. I mean, lamb's heads. For me, it's not odd. For other people, it is.
Because I follow you on Instagram, and I see when you put these pictures of every single part of the animal, and I can imagine vegan people who follow you.
They're horrified. I'm sure that in Turkey they have dishes that are slightly kind of unfamiliar, but as I have a very bad memory, I can't. But I have to say that raw lamb's liver that we have for breakfast, during the Civil War, I didn't go back to Lebanon for about 14 years. And the first time I went back and my mother got me some raw liver, I couldn't eat it the first time. And now I eat it with great kind of gusto. But after that long, it was a bit difficult for me to go back into it.
So maybe we'll take 1 more question from the crowd before we wrap it up. Majd, broad question, but what was a magic moment you've had on your food travels?
I had many, but I remember one in Zanzibar. our guide took us to his family, and she was preparing an iftar meal. There they call it futari. And she was making this very interesting bread with a very, very wet dough that she beat instead of kneading. And then she cooked it in a pan, in an aluminum pan over a hot fire, which is fine. You know, it was a wet dough that I had seen made in Greece. She sprinkled water on the pan before she spread the dough on it. But what was amazing is that when she thought the bottom was done, she picked up the pan and turned it over the fire like this. And I was thinking, oh my God, it's going to fall into the fire. And in fact, it didn't. It was stuck to the pan.
Because of the water?
Because of the water and the fact that it was a very wet dough. And she did it like this to kind of brown the top and cook the top. And then she scraped it off with a knife. It was really, really delicious.
I think
bread was absolutely wonderful.
I think bread making is one of the fascinating things that exist in life. It's so good. It's just flour and water, but then the number of possibilities is just endless. I think we have time for one more question, actually, if there's any left from the audience. Suhail, what factors will influence the evolution of Middle Eastern food? Any current trends that you believe will impact what we eat in the future? Will we eat beyond meat kafta? And
well, actually, I think climate change is going to impact what we eat in the future, and the lack of water. I mean, climate change being lack of water and not having access to some produce that cannot grow in hot weather or even like dry weather. But otherwise, I don't know. And the loss of the know-how, you know, if the young generation continues like being exported, I mean, it sounds terrible, but, you know, not learning how to cook traditional dishes, then we will lose some culinary lore, and the loss could be, I mean, you know, food changes naturally anyway, you know, with evolution, with modern times, with whatever. What Europeans eat now is very different from what they ate in medieval times. So there is a natural evolution, and then there is a dramatic evolution because of, you know, climate conditions or war conditions or whatever.
I mean, even the lady that makes bread that you were talking about, I mean, I don't see this happening 50 years from now.
No, unlikely. Although she had the young generation helping her, and they were cooking in the courtyard. They were not cooking in a kitchen. It was all in the open air, very improvised. I mean, improvised in my view, but not in theirs, because that's the way they lived and they cooked.
I know I keep saying last question, but I think we have time for one more. Elias Latouf, when it comes to Middle Eastern cooking, do techniques differ from Western cooking? If so, where does an amateur start?
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, in a way, there is less technique involved because, you know, you don't make sauces, you don't like, you know, clear broths. You don't. There are lots of things that you do in French cooking that we don't do in let's say in the Middle East. But what there's a lot of preparation. So you have to learn how to chop the parsley properly for the tabbouleh, and not in a machine, for instance, or not with a mezzaluna. I mean, there are methods, there are techniques, let's say, but not, you know, elaborate techniques that you need. The best way is to stand by your mother's side or your aunt or your grandmother or whatever, watch them the way I did. I was their kitchen pest. So I was there from when I was 2 or 3 or whatever, mainly because I was greedy, not because I was like intellectually curious. I was waiting for the food to be ready so that I could taste it.
But speaking of, I know we wanted to do a demo, but we didn't have time of you chopping tabbouleh. So can you just explain briefly how should one chop parsley for a good tabbouleh?
Okay, it's I'll try. First of all, you have to wash and dry the parsley and the mint. It needs to be dry so that you don't crush it and you don't dilute the seasoning. Then you kind of take your sprigs and you align them so that the leaves are all at the same level, more or less. You cut off the majority of the stalk. You leave a little bit, and then with your knife, let's say this is the parsley and this is my knife, you go like this. You shave, and you don't go like this. So you're kind of shaving.
You're not allowed to go twice.
No.
Honestly, yeah. Otherwise,
at the very end, when you have, straggly bits, you can do that. But it's so little that it's not going to damage. But if you're going twice or 3 times, you're bruising the herb and you're damaging the texture. I mean, you're spoiling the texture.
Yeah. I think, I've watched cooks, like restaurant cooks, chop parsley for 200 people a day, and it's just like holding this much parsley and then with one hand chopping it, and it's really fascinating. It's the main reason I don't do tabbouleh at home. Anissa, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for all these wonderful questions. I just want to give you the space for a minute in case you have any last words that you want to say, any positive thoughts amid this that we're living that you want to leave us with.
I think given the hardship in Lebanon and in Beirut in particular, anybody who can donate to any of the good NGOs, there is this organization called Impact Lebanon that is giving to different NGOs. And within Google, my niece actually has organized a fundraiser that is called like go/help-Lebanon, and she's collecting funds for that. So whoever is able to give, however little, it doesn't matter. There is such a huge need that it would be very helpful.
I agree. Thank you for that. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing your stories. It's really been an absolute pleasure having you, and thank you for our audience for being here and for asking amazing questions. I hope everyone has a nice day. Bye.
Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you.